This is trauma and resilience in tribal communities. This training is an introduction to research on trauma as it relates to AI/AN people and tribal communities, including trauma types, brain science, developmental and behavioral effects, and the interconnected nature of historical and current traumas. This workshop will also give practical scenarios and significant attention to resilience strategies. So something to note, when you registered, you signed up for a 4-hour training. Today we're doing 2 hours. Tomorrow we're doing 2 hours. Same place, same time. You should have a link for both. So I'd like to introduce our incredible speakers. We're so excited to pass this discussion on to them. First, I would like to introduce Amy Foster Wolferman, who is the Director of School-Based Training and Technical Assistance for the National Native Children's Trauma Center. She provides training and technical assistance to educators, school leaders, families, and community members in trauma-resilient school systems and practices, secondary traumatic stress interventions, trauma-informed positive behavioral interventions and supports, bullying prevention, and suicide prevention as well. Amy's primary area of focus is helping schools support the social and emotional needs of students impacted by trauma. She's co-authored the Bounce Back for Classrooms trauma-focused social skills curriculum, co-developed a trauma-informed systems change model, trauma resilient schools, and co-wrote the Walking the Four Directions traditional view of discipline trainers manual. In addition, she has served as an implementation specialist in multi-tiered systems of support and as a consultant for positive behavioral interventions and supports for schools. She has a background in teaching, early childhood education, special education, and working with youth in the outdoors. So Amy, welcome. We also have Veronica Willeto DeCrane, who is the Training and Technical Assistance Manager for the National Native Children's Trauma Center. She is Dene Navajo and of the many Hogan's clan and born for the Mexican clan. Her maternal grandfather is of the Tangle clan, and her paternal grandfather is of the Bitter Water clan. She was raised in Ojo Encino, New Mexico, on the Navajo reservation, and now lives in Montana after school, in Billings, Montana. Veronica has worked in Indian education and youth development for 12 years. She is currently president of the Montana After School Alliance Steering Council. At the University of Montana's National Native Children's Trauma Center, she provides trauma-informed care, training, and technical assistance for tribal youth programs and tribal juvenile healing to wellness courts in partnership with the Tribal Youth Resource Center. Veronica also offers TTA in education and in a variety of other tribal child serving systems, facilitates the NNCTC's Youth Advisory Council, supports cultural adaptation of trauma-informed care resources, and serves on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network Steering Committee. As you can see, we have two incredible speakers. We cannot wait to pass this conversation on. So Veronica, Amy, welcome and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that introduction. I will now share my screen. All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm not sure where you're located. Most probably good morning. Yes. Most of you are in California. We are in Montana. So as Jessica said, my name is Amy Foster Wolferman. I'm with the National Native Children's Trauma Center, and thank you for sharing that background. We're located in Missoula, Montana at the University of Montana. And our trauma center, the National Native Children's Trauma Center, was founded in 2007. And we primarily work to co-facilitate trauma-focused healing for Native children, families, and communities. And as Jessica said, a lot of my work is focused on supporting those in school settings. It's been a real pleasure to be learning and working in this center for many years since its inception. Prior to the founding of this center, I worked as a teacher and also have supported schools along the way with becoming more trauma resilient. But I'm happy to be here. We really are grateful for this invitation. And I just want to share with you that our as Jessica said, we're going to be doing 2 hours today, 2 hours tomorrow, and our focus is on focusing on defining key terms related to trauma, key terms and concepts, and that really includes that understanding of the concepts and the context of historical trauma as a beginning of impacts of trauma today and that connection between the two, historical and contemporary. We're also going to be looking at some basic research findings around trauma, including the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And then we're going to be looking at a connection between how trauma can impact the different developmental domains of our youth and what that might look like behaviorally. And then tomorrow we're going to move into looking at concepts of resilience and different ways that we can promote protective factors that help to support that development of resilience. What we want to mention before we get started is that when we talk about trauma, it can be difficult sometimes to be thinking about our own. We might be reminded of some of our own historical or past experiences or things that we may be experiencing currently. And just to take note, if we're starting to feel a bit distressed during this conversation, to really note that and take a moment to take care of yourself, step away, get some water. If you are still feeling a bit distressed after our conversations these next 2 days, we really encourage folks to seek help. The impacts of trauma are very real, but they are also very much something that we can heal if we recognize the impacts and we actually take that step to reach out for help. So we really do encourage anyone here to seek help as needed throughout these next couple of days and thereafter. So thank you for coming. Please do. We do hope that this is a conversation where we can both share some of this background knowledge and research and experiences that we've had, along with hearing from you all and moving forward towards supporting those that we work with that have been impacted by trauma. So really, I'm here to say greetings, and Veronica will be starting us off on this first section of our training. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for that great start and going over the learning objectives and getting us started in that way. I just wanted to welcome everyone here today and say that I'm really grateful that you're here to learn and to see what it is that what more we could learn about trauma and resilience. I know that there are a lot of trainings and professional development in this area. So you may have already attended trauma-informed care training before and have received some knowledge around trauma and its impacts. So we hope that what we have to offer you in this training, that it will be helpful to you, specifically as we are speaking about trauma in relation to tribal communities. And so as a tribal person, I think it's really important for us to understand the context of how trauma impacts tribal peoples, and also what that means in terms of how we can support tribal youth and communities and families through healing. And so one of the things that I like to start off with is just to talk about, why do we talk about trauma? And that's something, especially in tribal communities, that is important to address, because in some of our traditions and some of our protocols and our teachings, we don't often encourage emphasis on some of the parts that may be hurtful, things that may be harmful, things that may be they may be negatively impacting individuals. And so, as Amy shared, we definitely do not want to um, remind anyone of their own traumas, but sometimes as we're talking about this, that can happen. And so that is one of the teachings that I received as growing up in my community, that we don't want to open up wounds for people without providing them the support that they need. So we hope that being that this is a virtual session and you all are coming from different communities, and that you will be able to find the right resources that work for you and your community. So with this caution, we have to address the fact that we're going to be talking about a very difficult topic. And when we're going to be talking about a topic like this, we should be really intentional about why we're doing it. And so that's why we want to first kind of bring your attention to some of the reasons why we talk about trauma as a National Native Children's Trauma Center. And one of the first reasons is that we just want people to be aware of the impact that trauma can have on an individual, especially a young person who is going through their early years of development, and how that can then have lasting effects. It can impact them for their lifetime, and it can have an impact on their well-being, on their health, not just their physical health, also their spiritual, their emotional health. And so we want to just make sure that people are aware of the impacts that trauma can have, and that with this understanding, it can help to provide us with the knowledge that we need in order to be able to provide the right supports, to take care of ourselves, to take care of others. The other reason that we talk about trauma is that oftentimes when we discuss how trauma can have these impacts throughout a person's lifetime, that it can be discouraging to hear that, especially for maybe those of us who have experienced a lot of traumatic things in our childhood. And so it can be discouraging in that way. So we want to make sure that people are aware of and know that trauma can be prevented. There are things that we can do in our homes, in our workplaces, in our communities, that can prevent trauma exposure. We can also, when there's times that we can't prevent it, when there's times that we are exposed to it, or there's ongoing exposure, that we are aware that individuals can heal from trauma. And that's really important, especially in some of our tribal communities where we have experienced multiple types of traumas, and there's a high degree of trauma exposure, that it's really important for us to know that we can find healing. And so to be able to understand that even when it can feel like trauma is all around us, that healing is still possible. I think that's a really powerful understanding to have as we move through this content of trauma and we start to dig into how it can affect us. And then the last thing that we wanted to point out is that with this knowledge, arming ourselves with this knowledge of trauma and its impacts, it actually helps us in our work of helping others. And part of how that helps us is by giving us the right question. So we'll talk more about that, but we're going to talk about the trauma, having a trauma lens. And it's not really the idea that, we attribute everything to trauma, but it's more of the idea that we can consider how a young person, how an individual can be affected by trauma, that's a possibility, that it could be possible that they have a trauma history and that they have been exposed to trauma. And then it could be possible that today, as you're interacting with them, as you're trying to serve them and support them, as you're trying to come alongside them and offer them care and different services, that there's a way that we can actually think about how trauma impacts can be impacting their life, and we can start to ask a better question than maybe we've been asking before. So we're just going to start off by some definitions. As Amy mentioned, we're going to talk about some key concepts. And so we're going to start off by thinking about, how do we define trauma, especially when it comes to, a lot of us have different things in our lives that are stressful. There are things that maybe keep us up at night. There are things that are on our minds, and that we may be worried about or anxious about. So stress in our life is very real. But what we want to make sure people have an understanding of is what makes trauma different from just those daily stressors. And so thanks to SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, they actually did the work of convening together trauma survivors, trauma researchers, and trauma practitioners. And they discussed, how do we define trauma? And so on the screen, we have for you one definition of trauma. It may be what you are familiar with, but it is an experience first and foremost. That's really critical to understand, that it's a personal experience, and it's of a real or perceived threat, because sometimes what we may be experiencing, even though we may be going through the same exact event as someone next to us, that person may be experiencing that same event differently. So oftentimes it's not the actual event that is traumatic, it's the way that an individual has experienced that event. And then we also have recognized that trauma isn't just something that we experience firsthand. It's also things that our loved ones, that people that we care about, people that we're concerned for, that they go through. So we could be witnessing an experience that they're having, or we could be hearing about an experience that they're having, and that can be traumatic for us. And then the last part of it is that it's an overwhelming sense of terror, horror, and helplessness. So if you've ever experienced an overwhelmingness of this type, you could probably recognize that it's something that can feel out of control. Your emotions, your body's responses to it kind of take over, and it feels like it's more than you can handle. It feels like it's something that you don't have control over or a grip over. And so you actually have physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, all of these reactions to this experience that you're having in it, and it's overwhelming. There are different types of trauma experiences, and so we're just going to be covering 4 of them today. And so one of them is acute trauma, and that's basically a single event that occurs that is impactful to you. For example, let's say you've been through a car accident, and that car accident you felt was life-threatening. Maybe there's even your loved ones in the car with you, and so you felt like that car accident was life-threatening. You were overwhelmed by that experience. And so that can actually be an acute event that has occurred in your life that has traumatic impacts. And then chronic trauma is is basically a type of experience where you are experiencing multiple events. Sometimes it's the same type of event happening over and over, or it could be different types of events. So for example, perhaps you're experiencing abuse. And so maybe that abuse doesn't just occur one time, but it happens over and over and over. Or it could be that you're not just experiencing a car accident, but maybe you also at one point in your life got were robbed at gunpoint, or another point in your life where you experienced s- uh, a rape or some type of sexual abuse. And so those different types of traumas happen at different times in your life, but because they are happening one after the other, it can be considered chronic. And then the other type of trauma is complex. And this actually has to do a lot with um, some of these experiences that happen that are chronic, that happen multiple times, whether they're a type of event or there's different types of events, but they happen multiple times. And often they start when a person is really young, and it also happens during a time when they're going through really critical developmental stages. And so it can have a huge impact on their development. And so that's complex trauma. And oftentimes complex trauma is experienced by caregivers, someone in a person's life that is supposed to actually be there to keep them safe, to care for them, to take care of them. And so that's also adding to the difficulties of addressing this type of trauma, and that's why we call it complex. And then historical trauma, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides, but we're going to be discussing how historical trauma, what's unique about it is that it could be, there could be some acute events that happen in historical trauma, some chronic events that happen in historical trauma. There can actually be some complex events that happen. And so we'll talk more about that. But what makes it historical trauma is that there's ethnocidal and genocidal intent that is tied to these experiences that a group of people that share a collective identity go through. So we're going to be talking more about that. So Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is she actually works for the University of New Mexico, and similar to us, we are Category 2 Trauma Treatment Center. She is also leading another Category 2 Trauma Treatment Center at the University of New Mexico with the Tribes Project. She does, her and her team do a lot of work around historical trauma and what we can do to heal from it. And so a lot of kudos goes to her because she actually helped tribal communities with this term of historical trauma and defining it as it relates to tribal communities. So there are other groups in the world that have experienced historical trauma. For example, Maria shares how she learned about historical trauma by learning about the Jewish Holocaust and what happened to the Jewish people during that time and how that had lasting impacts on them. And so she actually started to do research with tribal communities, just kind of seeing some of the similarities between that experience and the experience of colonization that tribal peoples have been going through for the last 500 years. And so she was able to come up with this definition that I think is helpful to us. So historical trauma is a cumulative psychological wounding. So it's really important to understand that historical trauma wasn't just one historical event. It was actually a cumulative accumulation of different historical events, and that caused this psychological, there was some physical wounds, of course. There's some massacres that tribal communities have been through. Tribal communities have experienced the effects of disease. And so there's definitely some physical impacts, but there's also been some psychological wounds that has occurred as a result of these events. And they happened across generations. So that's how long these historical events have been happening. It's over multiple generations that these events have been happening, and including it often has happened throughout individuals' entire life, their whole lifespan. Some of these events that they've experienced, and it actually caused a massive group trauma. So whole communities, whole tribal nations have been experiencing this trauma together, have similarities in their responses to these traumatic events, and have had similar impacts as a result of them. So this has actually been a really significant event in our country's history, historical trauma. Again, not just one event, but ongoing cumulative experiences of trauma. And one of the things that can be that we can mistaken when it comes to historical trauma, that we can misunderstand about it, is that we think that it happened in the past, or that it happened like a very long time ago. And some of the events have happened a very long time ago. Some of the tribes that have been that no longer exist today, certainly, especially on the East Coast of our country, they some of those events that maybe they suffered from, and as a result are no longer in existence. Those things did happen a long time ago, but some of those events have actually happened in some of our more recent history. For example, the boarding schools, they happened even more recently, in the last early to mid 1900s. Some of the boarding schools were still in existence. And so some of these events, yeah, they happened in our history, but they're not, it's not that they happened in the past and they're no longer an issue today. It's actually the opposite. And as Whitbeck and his team, Whitbeck is a researcher. He has been studying historical trauma as well, and he describes it as experiences that started long ago, but they actually persist today. They continue to have lasting impacts. So these are just some examples of some of those impacts that tribal communities are experiencing today. So, for example, some of the historical events that may have occurred, that tribal peoples may have been through, such as being forced to live on reservations, maybe some of the treaties that they signed with the federal government. Those treaties have been broken, or they have not been fulfilled. And being forced assimilation, some of the federal policies that relocated tribal peoples to urban cities in order to assimilate them, in order to get them to change their way of life. And some of the boarding schools also had a similar intent of trying to erase some of their language and some of the culture that these tribes had. And so today, what we are seeing the impacts being is that today we see on a lot of the reservations that tribes are living on today, that there are very poor economic conditions, and that some of that ethnocidal and genocidal intent that that ill will towards tribal peoples, it actually persists today as a form of discrimination, as racism. And then some of the health disparities as a result of some of the traumas that tribal peoples have been through. So today we know that tribal communities are faced with a lot of health health issues to an extreme level, diabetes, heart disease, having a shortened lifespan. So, and then just the underfunding of some of the service systems. So in some of the treaties, there was a promise of being able to provide healthcare and education to tribes. And today we see that a lot of the education and health services that tribal communities are accessing, they're actually really underfunded, including the Indian Health Service has been severely underfunded and continues to be since the time that it existed. And then disparities in child protection and juvenile justice systems. So just the overrepresentation that we are finding tribal children being put into child welfare system and being put into juvenile detention centers, or having to be incarcerated in some way. So these are some of the lasting impacts that we are finding as a result of some of the historical traumatic events that have occurred. One of the themes that I like to point out about historical trauma that I think is important to understand is that of removal. So there was a removal of tribal peoples from their land, and that wasn't just easily something that could easily be overcome, because for tribal peoples, that removal from land meant that their whole economic systems, their whole spiritual systems were broken up, was taken from them. And so that forced removal, a lot of tribes experience things like for our tribe, for my tribe, we went through the long walk, and where a lot of our people died. And then, we often hear about the Trail of Tears and some of the tribes that were forced to be forcefully removed to Oklahoma. And so there's this whole theme around removal from land. There's also been a lot of policies, federal policies, that have forced children to be removed from their families, to be removed from their communities. And that occurred from the boarding schools. These boarding schools were not like schools that we know of today, where kids are getting, we feel that they are getting a decent education. These boarding schools, the tribal children were not getting the type of education that other children were getting. They were a lot of times they were doing labor for local communities where these boarding schools existed. A lot of times these children were experiencing malnutrition. They were starving in these schools. There was even some studies that were being done on these children to kind of see the impacts of malnutrition on children. They were testing them on the Native children in these boarding schools. You can see some on the picture there that a lot of times families didn't have a choice. They were actually forced to make their they hadn't they came and just took the children. And so they didn't actually have a say in whether or not they wanted their children to be in these schools. And even if they did have a say, a lot of times they didn't know about the conditions of these schools until like children were starting to run away from them. A lot of children died in these schools. They experienced abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. So there's just a lot of that went into these boarding schools, and a lot of it was they were removed from their families, but what happened as a result of that is that they lost connection to their culture. They lost connection to their people and to their families and to their community. So even if they did go back, maybe at 18 years old, they might have left at 6 years old and gone back until they were 18 years old. Even if they did go back to their community, they experienced a lot of a difficult time reconnecting and reintegrating back into their communities. So we're talking about historical trauma. So we wanted to give you guys a chance to process that. So we're going to have these small group discussions, and we're going to give you guys about 8 minutes in your small groups to think about these two questions. What are the signs of historical trauma that you see in Reggie's story? And how might these traumas be influencing Reggie's life? So in the chat, you're going to find a handout that has, it's called scenarios. And so you're going to see different scenarios. And so for this group discussion, we're going to be talking about Reggie. So go ahead and read Reggie's scenario and then talk with your group about these two questions. Where do you see historical trauma showing up in his life, and how do you think it's impacted him? I hope you all were able to read through Reggie's story and speak about some of the experiences that he's had in his life. I like to refer to him as Grandpa Reggie. And as we go through some of the other scenarios, you'll kind of see why, but I'm curious to hear what you guys were able to talk about in this short time. So if you could, in the chat, just share what your group was able to speak to in terms of what signs of historical trauma you noticed as you read his story. And then if you were able to talk about some of the ways in which it influenced his life, if you could put that in the chat as well. Yeah, so Mary mentioned that they saw so much happen with him. His language was interrupted, absolutely. And not being able to speak his language, having boarding school and separation from family and culture and that disconnection, loss of community, the death of elders and guidance, removal of identity. He was sent to school, boarding school, and told not to speak his language. And he lost his identity when he was sent away and didn't get a chance to get it back because his elders had already passed away by the time he got back. So removal, stripped of language, culture, repeated patterns, no tools for healing, no support leading to unprocessed trauma, leading to unable to support daughter with her trauma process. He lost all connections and now it's seen too much in families now. No coping methods, loss of culture and customs, loss of safety among community, anger and coping. With his daughter, the main option he saw available was separation. Yes. I'm glad you brought that up, Michael. His trauma passed down to his daughter. Daughter-family relationship or daughter-father relationship suffered loss of family, loss of his grandmother and mother while he was taken away, fear of his daughter repeating behavior, intergenerational trauma with daughter, and expectations about how she needed to figure it out on her own. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. And different idea of what family structure and support looks like. Yes. He was absent in her younger years and his daughter's younger years. Absolutely. So you guys brought up so much. I think you guys hit on just the different ways in which it's impacting not just him, but you guys have mentioned how it impacted his daughter, and maybe we can kind of see how it might have impacted others in the community who he left behind. And we kind of see that some of them had already passed away by the time he had come back. So there's a lot of loss there for different people involved and connected to Reggie, as well as his own losses that he's been through. So thank you guys so much for processing historical trauma with me. We're now gonna talk more about, you guys mentioned intergenerational trauma and how his trauma got passed down to his daughter. And so we're going to watch a video about that as we talk more about that, as we talk more about some of the traumas that get passed down and how that can look like with some of the tribal families that we're serving, and other families that we may be serving who are experiencing intergenerational trauma. So we're going to watch a video about a study that really talks about the impacts of trauma in childhood, and how that continues to affect an individual throughout their life, including some of their health outcomes. So we'll go ahead and watch that. I actually want to reshare because I want to make sure the sound is working.
When we think about public health, do we consider the importance of our childhood experiences? What if they have a bigger impact on our health than we could ever imagine? Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are instances of stress and trauma during childhood that determine physical and mental health outcomes during adulthood. What exactly does adverse mean? What is adversity? Adversity is also known as difficulty or hardship. People can experience adversity directly from individuals, like abuse inflicted by one person to another, as well as from the pervasive structures in our society, like discrimination from our social, political, and economic systems. So where does this correlation between adverse childhood experiences and health outcomes originate from? This correlation was discovered in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, or ACE study. From 1995 to 1997, Dr. Vincent Folletti from Kaiser Permanente and Dr. Robert Anda from the Centers for Disease Control assessed childhood trauma in a range of over 17,000 adults. Jane Stevens, founder and publisher of social network ACEs Connection, explains why Drs. Folletti and Anda created the study.
So Dr. Vincent Folletti is a pretty remarkable guy, and he's very curious about why things happen or why they don't happen. So he's at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, and he was running an obesity clinic for Kaiser patients. And these were people who were morbidly obese, 100, 200, 300, 400 pounds overweight. he noticed that quite a few of the people who were in the weight clinic were dropping out. And he wanted to understand why, and he thought, what are we doing wrong? You know, maybe they're not losing weight, but he looked at all their records and found that every one of them was losing weight. And he couldn't figure out why people who were successfully losing weight would leave. So he brought them in to ask them why they had left the program, and to try to figure out what would have led them to do that, you know. And so he went through a whole series of questions, and then one day he misspoke, and he, instead of asking, how old were you when you were first sexually active, he asked, how much did you weigh when you were first sexually active? And the woman who he was interviewing said 40 pounds, and she burst into tears. And she said, and it was with my father, and thank you for asking. And that just blew his mind. And he thought, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe I should ask that question more often. And so he did. And then he was afraid that he was sort of putting some bias into it. So he had some other physicians do the list of questions. But what was very clear is what he was getting was reports of incest that he had assumed was very rare. And what he was saying was very commonplace. But then he was also finding that people were gaining weight because they thought it was a good defense mechanism, either to keep people away from them, you know, potential sexual abusers, or it made them feel safer because they had been bullied when they were, you know, young, scrawny kids, and they thought that gaining a lot of weight would help them. So he understood that weight was a solution for them and not a problem.
They assessed 10 types of adverse childhood experiences in the study: emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, emotional or physical neglect, substance abuse, mental illness, separation or divorce, incarcerated family member, and domestic violence. They also created a scoring system for ACEs. For every ACE a participant had experienced, they got a point on their ACE score. So if someone experienced physical neglect, no matter how often, they would receive a score of 1. If a person experienced physical neglect and had a parent with mental illness, they received a score of 2, and so on. Then, the doctors correlated the ACE scores with health outcomes. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, founder of the Center for Youth Wellness in San Francisco, is a leading medical professional on adverse childhood experiences. In this segment of her TED Talk, she describes the results of the ACE study.
What they found was striking. 2 things. Number 1, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America.
All right, we're going to stop the video there. Feel free to drop in chat your reactions to that clip about the adverse childhood experiences study. So the ACE study actually taught us a lot about trauma and its effects on people, on human beings. And oftentimes when we work with tribal communities, we are asked, what does this mean for tribal peoples? And so in the study, it was pointed out that one of the things that they found that maybe was what stood out to you, it certainly stood out to me, was how common trauma was. That 60%, I think around 60% of them, of those who were in this study had experienced at least one ACE. So they had at least a score of 1 on that questionnaire. And so I think that's really impactful because when you actually dig into the background of this study, you find that it was conducted in Southern California. It was predominantly white individuals that they were studying, and many of them, if not all, had health insurance. So they had income enough to afford health insurance. And so with this population, we think that, they have stable income. Maybe they don't experience as much trauma as others, but they actually found that trauma was pretty common experience. As you saw in the video, they even said, they were surprised by how common even the experience of incest was. And so that's one of the things that stood out to me. And so we often are asked when we work with tribal communities, what the trauma exposure rates are. And so these are just some studies that have been conducted. Of course, there are over 570 federally recognized tribes, and even more state recognized tribes, and even more unrecognized tribes that are not recognized by the state or the federal government yet. And so we can't really say across the board that this is absolutely true for all tribal communities, but in the studies that have been conducted around ACEs, we are finding that in those studies that there is a high rate of trauma exposure in childhood. And so as you can see in the third column from the left, the trauma exposures that in this study where they were looking at incarcerated Native people in New Mexico, 97% experienced at least one ACE. In the study where they're looking at youth, 14 to 24 on a reservation, that 78% of them experienced at least one ACE. So you can see that just that exposure to even one ACE is remarkably high. And then in the last column, you can see that those that have experienced multiple, 4 or more ACEs, in some instances, that was also pretty high. I think Dr. Nadine Burke pointed out that there was at least 16% of the participants had experienced 4 or more ACEs. So you can see that it's actually really significantly higher than what was found in the original ACE study. I think it's also important to point out that there were 10 types of traumas that were looked at in that ACE study. And since then, there's actually been some research done around other types of traumas as we're learning more about different trauma experiences and what impacts individuals. in a traumatic way, we are finding that there's other types of traumas that have similar impacts on life, on health outcome, including traumatic grief, school violence, medical traumas. Can you guys think of any other traumas that individuals might experience, maybe some of the families or the young people that you work with, that they might be experiencing, that may have an impact on their life? Feel free to put that into chat as well. So thanks to Mary, she commented that the ACE studies helps families address the trauma they have experienced and be able to heal from going from what's wrong with me to what happened to me. Absolutely. We'll talk more about trauma responses, but a lot of times when we talk about what's wrong with a person, we're often talking about their trauma responses because we may not know their personal trauma history. And so definitely when we ask the question, what happened, instead, we would actually be able to understand that some of their behaviors might be related to trauma. Absolutely. And the A study is actually looking at trauma exposure, which is different from actual an individual being impacted by trauma. So we know that in childhood, there are adverse childhood experiences, but there are also positive childhood experiences. And so for some children who may experience an ACE, they also experience PACEs or positive childhood experiences. And so they're able to recover from some of that adversity. And so at the time that they're filling out the ACE study questionnaire, they may have been exposed to a trauma in their childhood, but they may not be experiencing some of the symptoms or continuing to deal with some of the effects of it because they've been able to recover. So there are other types of measurements that help us look at symptoms that people are currently experiencing from past traumas or current traumas. I think it's also important to point out some of the system and community level traumas. We often think about trauma on an individual level, but there are actually community level traumas and system level traumas that entire communities, entire families are going through. And these are just some examples of some of those. If you can think of any others, feel free to share that in the chat. So I like that Mary mentioned social media can be traumatic for some people, absolutely, especially if they're experiencing bullying. We're seeing some studies around the impacts of social media having on mental health. Trauma from birth experience, absolutely. What happens, in utero, or what happens, during pregnancy can definitely affect an individual. So now that we've discussed ACEs a little bit, and hopefully you have been able to, if this is your first time learning about the ACE study, you've been able to kind of think a little bit about how trauma can affect an individual's health outcomes. And so we're going to go ahead and go back into our small groups. And this time, you guys were introduced to Sherry and Reggie's story, but we're going to read Sherry's story. And we're going to learn more about how not just the historical trauma, but also some of the other types of traumas may have been impactful to Sherry and may have been affecting her. And so we're going to read about her and what's going on in her life. So again, we'll go ahead and put you into breakout rooms. And just kind of think about what some of those different types of traumas are, in addition to historical trauma. And then think about some of the behaviors that you're noticing Sherry is dealing with, and how, if you feel like they are linked to some of those traumas that you may know of from her story. Thanks for taking that time to discuss with your group. Go ahead and put in the chat what you noticed about Sherry's story. Write down the trauma type or the trauma that you think that she was exposed to, and then the behaviors that you think it's linked to in her life. So what are some of those behaviors in her life that you feel that her trauma experiences are linked to? So go ahead and drop that in the chat. So we have Evangeline, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Evangelina, sharing sexual abuse. She experienced sexual abuse and feeling that's caused her to feel like she didn't matter. Wendy talked about neglect from parents. She experienced neglect. And then homelessness, loss of education, sexual abuse. There's a community or system level trauma, school and housing support. And the sexual abuse from her parents, friend. She's using substances to cope with past trauma, absolutely. She's being excluded at school. That could be traumatic for her. Abandonment could be her trauma. Housing instability when grandma died, when she got kicked out, and when she was living in the car. Yes, that could definitely be traumatic for her. Severe neglect while living with parents. Yes. A lack of trust, on feeling unworthy, the unwanted child. Those are some of maybe some of the impacts of the trauma she's been through. She's disconnecting from son by giving him the phone to help him calm down. Yes, there's that disconnection that's happening again. Drug exposure, difficulty in healthy relationships, attachment disorder because of neglectful parents. She could possibly be dealing with that. So definitely lots of examples. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Her school is similar to boarding school. Racism is present. Yes. Repeated cycle and symptoms from all of the above. Yes. So thank you so much for sharing all that, guys. So we're just practicing thinking about an individual's behaviors, and maybe, you know, to us, some of their behaviors are parents. We see them, we notice them. They may be even affecting us when we're interacting with them. So now we're trying to develop a trauma lens by considering maybe some of the trauma histories, some of the experiences that a person may have gone through that is causing them to behave in those ways. So thank you guys so much for practicing that with this activity. We're going to go ahead and move on to talking about the impact of trauma on developments. And so I'm going to pass it over to Amy, and she's going to finish us up for today.
We're going to start this section by looking at a little bit more on the impacts of trauma in the video that we began.
Why does this relationship exist?
Hear that?
Why does childhood trauma lead to negative health and social outcomes during adulthood? The answer lies in how stress affects the developing brains and bodies of children. Let's look at two children. We'll call them Child A and Child B. Child A grows up in an environment where adults are unsupportive and dangerous. Child A experiences traumatic and stressful events on a regular basis. Child B grows up in an environment where adults are loving and supportive. Child B experiences stress occasionally, but feels safe most of the time. These children's brains will develop based on their unique experiences in each of their environments. Our brains are wired based on sensory experience. Neurons are cells in the brain that transmit messages throughout the body. They make connections when they receive or send information. Jennifer Silverstein is a licensed clinical social worker who supports families and specializes in children aged 0 to 3. She explains how a child's developing brain creates neural connections.
When we have repetitive activity that comes in predictable patterns, it reinforces that wiring, and the most used areas of the brain become the most developed. When it comes to early childhood trauma, that is really important because when children live with fear, when there is traumatic experience in their house, when there's domestic violence or there's child abuse, those areas of their brain that control the fear response get hyperdeveloped. They get really good at being afraid. Right, and at being reactive and protective around fear. On the flip side, one thing that often doesn't get talked about nearly enough when we talk about trauma is neglect. So when children, maybe they don't have anything to be afraid of, but they're not getting the right amount of relational interaction, they're not getting all those beautiful moments where mom comes in and swoops them up, or dad or auntie comes in and swoops them up and locks eyes and coos together, and they have this really beautiful relational experience. When they don't get that, then the areas of their brain that control things like social bonding and empathy are underdeveloped.
When we experience a dangerous event, we have a fight or flight response. Our bodies prepare us either to fight a threat or run from it.
Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging.
In Child A's world, adults are unpredictable and threatening. Child A's stress response system is going to be turned on almost all the time because they are constantly protecting themselves from danger. This is called a toxic stress response. Child A stays aroused and hypervigilant with stress chemicals in their body. In Child B's world, adults are safe and supportive. Child B's stress response will only be activated when they feel scared or threatened. Their body doesn't keep them in fight or flight all the time because it doesn't need to. This is a healthy stress response. It will help the child to build stress tolerance and learn how to handle a stressful event in the future.
We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center.
Now let's look at Child A and Child B in a real-world context, school. In the classroom, children are expected to sit quietly and focus. Child B might have no problem doing this, but Child A, who has grown up in an almost constant toxic stress response, will probably not be able to focus in class. The parts of their brain in charge of fear and reactivity are overdeveloped, and the parts that would help them stay calm and pay attention are underdeveloped. Child A has adapted to be reactive and impulsive as a survival mechanism. Brian Farraher is the executive director of the Hannah Boys Center in Sonoma, California, a residential treatment center for at-risk boys.
So a lot of what we see with our kids is their behavior is actually really adaptive to some hard situations they've grown up in. So if you're, for instance, if you're very volatile, it keeps people at bay. It protects you. Right? So for a lot of our kids, their behavior in the context of maybe how they've grown up makes a lot of sense. And then they come into a treatment environment like ours here, and people kind of go, well, they're safe here, everybody's nice to them or whatever, but that's not their life experience. And so we have to understand context for these kids.
So I think that's a helpful video to get us thinking about where our kids, if we're thinking of kids impacted by trauma, where they might be internally when they're dealing with these experiences of trauma. I'm going to walk us through some common reactions. And this list of common reactions, if we've had experiences of trauma, we might have a common reaction of this bulleted list. We might have one of them, we might have several of them, we might have some other symptoms. And over time, they might go away as we are also, not only are we impacted by trauma, but we are also very resilient as human beings. So these things, these symptoms, these reactions can fade over time as we heal. The problem becomes when we get stuck in some of these reactions. And so it's like you can think of it in terms of a spectrum, common reactions to trauma, getting stuck in these common reactions, so traumatic stress, and then getting really stuck or experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, where these very same reactions become a long-term disorder. So starting with the first common reaction here, hyperarousal. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term. It's just being in that state of constant fear, always looking out for danger, on high alert, not being able to focus or engage or be present because we're scanning our environments, looking out for danger so that we're able to see it coming and be able to protect ourselves. Re-experiencing is another, and that is when we are kind of uncontrollably, we have these thoughts and images or sounds or feelings that remind us of the trauma. So it can just flood us. Our minds can be flooded with these memories, and it can be really difficult to stop them. And another term to describe re-experiencing is flashbacks. And then avoidance is when we work as hard as we can to not have to think about, feel, or be reminded of our trauma. So we may avoid going to places that remind us, being around people that remind us. For example, if a traumatic experience occurred on a playground, we may never want to go to a playground again. Not only the playground where this experience happened, but any playground, because it's a reminder. So we might see some avoidant behaviors that might look a lot like defiance or aggression or tantruming, and not realize that underlying that is this fear of being reminded of our trauma. And numbing is a real kind of an extreme form of avoidance. So if you can't really escape some of these situations that are unpleasant, that are trauma reminders, we might mentally kind of leave the present, leave our bodies and check out. So it's of the fight, flight, freeze. It's the freeze response where I have no other way to protect myself than to just, I can't fight off the danger. I can't run from the danger. The only option I have is to mentally escape the situation. And so that might look like a child shutting down completely, being non-responsive. And then we might also see changes in affect. So a child who may have once been kind of easygoing, if it's in a school setting, maybe they're following directions, not a big deal. And then we might start to see some aggression or frustration, irritability, some different kinds of behaviors, maybe related to their experience of trauma. And after experiences of trauma, it's common to see the world does not look like such a pleasant place. After all of these negative experiences that I've had, I start to project those into my future because bad things have happened. I assume that bad things are going to continue to happen. So some of us might develop this state of hopelessness, that things are just not going to change, that I have no control over what's happening to me. It's all been bad and it's going to continue to be that way. And finally on this list is cognitive distortions. And that's really that thinking that, for example, the reason these traumatic experiences have happened to me is because I'm a bad kid. I deserve this. I should have been able to stop this from happening to my friend or to my mother or to someone else, and just really kind of taking the blame when it really, clearly is not the blame of the child, but sometimes that can be the perception, sort of that distorted thinking that it's all my fault. So again, common reactions, the difficulty becomes when we get stuck and these start to impact our daily functioning. But most of us, actually, most of the time, we are able to heal. We are resilient. And so that's sort of the beauty of our humanity. The other piece of this is thinking about triggers. I'm sure we're all familiar with or trauma reminders. And it's really that being reminded of something, maybe it's a sight, something you see, something you hear, something you smell that reminds of the trauma, and it puts us right back into that state of fear or terror, or as you can see here, fight, flight, freeze mode. I think it's really helpful to think about. I like to utilize Dr. Daniel Siegel's hand model, and how he kind of uses the hand to show the different portions of the brain. And just to point out a couple here, our thumb, we could consider that our limbic system, and our four fingers that can wrap over that limbic system is the prefrontal cortex. And so when we are in that state of fight, flight, freeze, he calls it flipping our lid. So the prefrontal cortex, where we have use our logic brain, our reasoning, we're able to control our impulses, make decisions, analyze situations, that goes out the window. And our limbic system is on hyper alert or hyper drive mode. And so in our fight, flight, freeze mode, we flip our lids. And so when a child is triggered or experiencing a trauma reminder, they're flipping their lid. And so one of the hardest things to do, even sometimes we may want to use language to help a child to put their lid back on. Hey, just calm down, it's okay. But that language portion of the brain is really not accessible in that moment. And so we need to do something else to help create that sense of felt safety for the child to feel, to be able to re-regulate, when they're in this dysregulated state of fight, flight, freeze. What can we do without using a lot of language to help the child to feel safe in the moment? So we're going to look at some of those approaches and practices. But I want to draw your attention here to a study that was done by Dr. Seth Pollack. And what he did was take a series of faces and morphed different types of emotions into those faces. And if you are looking at the screen, on the far left is one type of emotion. And just think in very simple terms, what emotion would you label those two faces on the far left of the screen. Just your basic emotions vocabulary. What would you label that there as on the far left? And we have anger. Great, thank you, Billy. So anger on the left. What about the far right? What do we see there on the far right? Okay, a couple of angers. So yeah, sadness. Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. So what Dr. Pollack did was have different groups of students, although he did it individually, but students who had experienced abuse and those who had not experienced abuse, look at these faces, starting with sadness and then moving over from sadness towards anger, and note when they first detect anger in that face. So starting on the right, you could number these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Starting on the right with number 1, moving towards the left, where do you first detect anger in those faces? And you can just drop that in the chat. 6s, 7s, 5s, 8s, 3s, 7s, 6s. Great. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. So what he found in his study was that the children who had not experienced abuse were first detecting anger in around 7s, 8s, and 9s. And those who had experienced abuse were picking up anger on the 3s, somewhere around 3 and 4. And so it was a real big difference in how these children were viewing these faces and when they were detecting anger. Anyone willing to share either verbally or in the chat why that might be? Why would kids who've experienced abuse see anger in faces when others don't?
Maybe out of self-preservation and just because they've experienced it, they are hyper-vigilant and used
Absolutely.
to kind of looking for the signs and triggers. So, as a way to protect themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. They're used to looking out for themselves. They're in that state of hyperarousal, always constantly on the lookout for danger. They're doing it to protect themselves, and they might see it when it's not actually there. And so it's just a brilliant way for us human beings to protect ourselves. And it's just becomes problematic when we start to apply our experiences of trauma to places where it's not necessary, when we are actually safe. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on. I know we just have a few minutes left. So thinking in terms of the impact of trauma, we do note that it's very common for those with trauma experiences to have difficulty with self-regulation. So difficulty being able to understand or describe what's happening internally. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling? How is this feeling different from another type of feeling? And so that ability to self-regulate can really be impacted by those who have experiences of trauma. And so not understanding what's happening internally, but then also not being able to communicate or express what's happening internally. And so another impact emotionally too is that what we're experiencing on a more regular basis in terms of feelings we see more worry and fear and anxiety and shame, often with that cognitive distortion and guilt. And the experience of joy can be rare. So fortunately, in terms of trauma-informed approaches and practices, these are things that we can work to build as a part of developing resiliency. Next, and in terms of social development, the experience of trauma is very often related to relationship. It happens within the context of relationship. And so we might just start to feel isolated from others, withdrawn, and having those thoughts of there's something wrong with me, I deserve this. I start to feel disconnected from my friends and family and others. I can certainly start to develop feelings of distrust. Bad things have happened to me. I can't trust people. I'm going to reflect that perception onto others. and just expect that bad things are going to happen to me. So it can be really difficult, as we all know, to support a child who's got a history of trauma in developing that trust, and can take a lot of time and consistency and repetition of I'm going to be there, I'm going to show up, I'm going to say what I say, I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. And over time, with that repetition, we can slowly alter that perception. And I'm going to share 2 more slides, and then we'll pick up where we leave off tomorrow. So the impact cognitively, if we're constantly in this state where we're flipping our lid, in that fight, flight, freeze mode, it makes a lot of sense that we're going to have difficulty being able to attend, to be present, to be able to concentrate, to really generally be engaged in the moment. And so our limbic system is being overutilized, and our executive functioning, our prefrontal cortex, is being underutilized. And so that can have an impact on the development of that portion of our brain and those skills that we obtain through that exercising of the prefrontal cortex. And so we may see delays in, especially at school, in performance and achievement. And sometimes we might think it's a learning disability or some other kind of issue that's interfering with learning, when actually oftentimes it is the experience of trauma. It's traumatic stress. It's traumatic stress reactions. We might see then all of this relating to communication, frustration. I'm dumb. I can't do this. I'm stupid. I don't like this anymore. I want to leave. I want to drop out. So we kind of see this spiraling down, struggling with the content, because basically I'm not present and engaged to be able to absorb it and learn it. And then you can see it kind of spiral down from there. And we see a lot of referrals then to special education, or maybe some mental health disorder labeling, ADHD, bipolar disorder, when really it's the impacts of trauma. And the last slide I want to show you today before we close comes from the work of Dr. Bruce Perry. He's the director of the Child Trauma Academy. Many of you have probably heard of him. He wrote the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. He was a clinical psychiatrist, and in this book shared many of the stories following patients through their life histories, and kind of making that connection between early childhood trauma and later life impacts. But here we have on these 3 rows, and on the bottom we have the internal state. In the middle, we have the dissociative continuum, and on the top, we have hyperarousal continuum. So I'm just going to ask you this question, looking at the terms on the bottom row: calm, alert, alarm, fear, terror. Where do you think that your brain is at its optimum working condition? What state of mind? What state do you do your best thinking in? Calm, alert, alarm, fear, or terror? Alert. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and that's when our brains, we have not flipped our lid. We have it fully locked. We are able to utilize all the pieces and parts of the neurons, and the neural pathways are connected. So in the state of alert or calm, we can do our best thinking. Now think of a child who maybe is living, back to the video, child A and child B. Child A, who is dealing with some trauma in the household, living in a more chaotic environment, what mental state would you guess they wake up in the morning prior to anything even happening? They've just opened their eyes. Which internal state? Even though nothing has happened yet, what would you guess? Alarm, thanks Paige. Alert, thanks Mary. Fear, thanks Evangelina. Yeah, and Dr. Perry found in his study that it's often kids with trauma histories often wake up in a state of alarm. That kind of their baseline heart rate is typically higher, as is their blood pressure. So waking up in a state of alarm. And if you go up to the top row, the hyperarousal continuum, that looks like, a child who tends to be a bit more on the hyperarousal continuum, waking up and wake up resistant. And it doesn't take much to move from a state of alarm to a state of fear or even terror through these trauma reminders or situations happening in the environment that might push them back into that fight, flight, freeze mode, and where they are flipping their lids. So we might see a child move from resistant to defiant very quickly. And so I think what I'm going to do then is pick up on this conversation tomorrow, because we are at the 1 o'clock hour here in Montana, noon your time. And we do have time to continue this then. So I just want to thank you for your participation today. And are there any closing words, Dana, that need to be shared for the conference?
We have no closing words today other than, as Amy has noted, this training does continue with the second part tomorrow. You should have the link. It was a 2-day calendar when you registered, but if you have any difficulty with that link in the morning, do just send us an email at info@caltrin.org. I'm going to put that in the chat.
Thank you all for the thank yous.
And we look forward to seeing everyone again tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone.